morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Craig, and I am your host. It is a pleasure to have you participate in today's webinar, COVID-19, Fundraising in an Economic Downturn. Before I welcome you, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. First of all, please be aware that all lines are muted. If you would like to ask a question, there are two ways to do so. You can use the raise hand icon on your screen. We will unmute your line and you may ask your question or questions. You can always type your question or questions in the Q&A box, which is also located on your screen. We all know that technology can be trying these days, especially while working from home. So if you lose your connection, you may also reconnect using the link emailed to you. And finally, the presentation and recordings are available on Prosperity Indiana's COVID-19 Resources Hub, located on our website. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm Carrie Craig, and I'm the Capacity Development Manager for Prosperity Indiana. And I've already and repeatedly been amazed by the evidence I've seen in the resilience of our own team and the individuals and organizations we serve. We are better together. So to help aid efforts to create a successful recovery story for local governments, for organizations, and for people and places they serve, we're happy to partner with the Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy and Dr. Sharik Siddiqui to provide information on an important resource for organizations. We're thankful for their partnership as well as that of Fifth Third Bank. Fifth Third has been supporting our COVID-19 resources and capacity building response efforts through a Strengthening Our Communities grant and has been a great model for being in this together. I would now like to introduce Jadira Hoptree with Fifth Third. Jadira serves as Vice President and Community Economic Development Manager for Fifth Third Bank, Indiana Region, overseeing the charitable giving process, deploying Fifth Third Foundation grants, and guiding lending and economic development programs for underserved communities in the state. Jadira?
Good morning. Happy Monday, everyone. Carrie, it feels nice that we now have kind of a Monday morning routine or rhythm as we create our new normal. Once again, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to the Prosperity Indiana team for the amazing work you're doing throughout this incredible time. Also, thank you to the presenter and you, all the participants, for dedicating the time to continue working together. As Carrie mentioned, Indiana is in this together. At Fifth Third, we continue to support and learn from our communities. As last Friday, we have deployed over $450,000 for human needs, microlending programs, and capacity building as this webinar across Indiana. And yesterday, May 3rd, we celebrated Fifth Third Day, 5-3, get it? I think that we are the only bank that has its own unique day. As we have in recent years, we are meeting this Fifth Third Day and the month of May to fighting hunger in our communities. More than ever, with the coronavirus and the economic downturn, the demand for food and other social services has increased, and we are here to support it. To help address the pressing need to feed our communities, in honor of Fifth Third Day, we have provided 1.6 million meals throughout bank donations to various food organizations to feed the hungry across our 10-state footprint and beyond. Our efforts will continue throughout the month of May. In addition, we, the staff of Fifth Third Bank, will be able to individually contribute by participating on a walking-in-place challenge that can generate $53,000 extra for Feeding America, and with individual donations from our own wellness reward points. In summary, we are committed to supporting inclusive economic mobility. And with our commitment, Fifth Third will continue to be present, addressing the needs through donations, increased hiring opportunities, and the free virtual financial empowerment programs that we have discussed in the last webinars. Prosperity Indiana has offered to post the links to these programs in its COVID-19 hub. Please review them and share with your clients, friends, and family. Also, feel free to contact me if you are looking for volunteers to assist deliver some of the workshops or have any technical difficulties. We take seriously our role in helping our community to get back to work, and these are ways of creating more of opportunities with jobs that might offer a new career, a comprehensive benefit, financial empowerment tools that will provide you tips for good money management, and donations to support those most in need. We will stay in touch and continue to be at the forefront of sharing our best practices and expertise throughout this time. Again, we are grateful to Prosperity Indiana for leading the way in this communication program. Thank you, everyone. Be well, and look forward to learning more today. Carrie, back to you.
Thank you, Jadira, and thank you to our partners at Fifth Third Bank for making today's webinar possible. Before we begin, many of you may not have been exposed to Prosperity Indiana, and this may be your first time hearing about us. And we're going to just provide you with a little bit of a snapshot of who we are. We were founded over 30 years ago as the Indiana Association for Community and Economic Development. We are a statewide intermediary organization with a local focus. Prosperity Indiana's member organizations strengthen communities and improve lives in rural, suburban, and urban areas in all of Indiana's 92 counties. Members provide housing opportunity, they meet basic needs, they connect Hoosiers to jobs, they create vital places, they do all of this and more. We impact communities, individuals, and organizations. And we do this through resources, engagement, advocacy, and programs. If you'd like to learn more about us, please check out our website at www.prosperityindiana.org. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this morning, Dr. Shariq Siddiqui. Shariq is an assistant professor of philanthropic studies and director of the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at the Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy. Shariq has a PhD and MA in philanthropic studies from the Lilly Family School. He also has a JD from the McKinney School of Law at Indiana University and holds a BA in history from the University of Indianapolis. Shariq authors research on Muslim philanthropy and Muslim nonprofit sector. Most recently, he conducted a national survey of full-time Islamic schools in the United States. The project resulted in the book that he co-authored, Islamic Education in the United States and the Evolution of Muslim Nonprofit Institutions, published in November 2017. Shariq also serves as the co-editor of the Journal of Muslim Philanthropy and Civil Society, Journal on Education in Muslim Societies, and is the series editor of the Muslim Philanthropy and Civil Society book series, all three of which are published by Indiana University Press. He has served as a nonprofit practitioner for over 20 years for international, national, regional, and local nonprofit organizations. Previously, Shariq served as the executive director of the Association for Research of Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. ARNOVA is a leading international association that connects scholars, teachers, and practice leaders in research on nonprofit organizations, voluntary action, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Shariq Siddiqui. Shariq?
Good morning, Carrie, and good morning, Jadira. Thank you so much for such a warm introduction and this opportunity to speak to your colleagues here in Indianapolis. I'm really excited about being part of this and really appreciate Prosperity Indiana and Fifth Third Bank for making this possible, making this webinar possible. I know as being a nonprofit practitioner myself for over 20 years and having dealt with at least a couple of major crises as a nonprofit director, how challenging these times can be for those of us that work in the nonprofit sector. And so it's really important. And one of the things I've been doing over the last 2 weeks is speaking to nonprofits across the country on how to navigate the challenges they face, specifically with fundraising. And nearly 1,000 people from the nonprofit sector have attended those. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be part of this. I did want to start off by saying thank you to my colleagues at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, whose research really informs much of what I will share. In particular, I did want to thank the Fundraising School, which is the professional development arm of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which has provided some information and is a sort of a market leader when it comes to training in the fundraising sector. Second, I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Patrick Rooney, Executive Associate Dean for Academic Programs, and he's Professor of Economics and Philanthropic Studies, and Dr. Lori Hallberg, who is the Mott Chair on Community Philanthropy. And I'll be sharing some of the information from their work today as we talk about the crisis and talking about fundraising during the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to preface my remarks to say that as we thought about how this crisis would impact philanthropy, there was a lot of major discussion, a lot of conversations. But the reality is that much of everything that we're saying could be anything from a wild guess to perhaps a well-educated wild guess, right? Given the unprecedented nature of this virus and the reactions around the world. And likely in recent history, there hasn't been another historical episode which really provides us the relevant data through which we can compare. As part of my research, the book that Carrie mentioned actually looked at Muslim American nonprofits, specifically Islamic schools, and how they navigated 9/11 and the Great Recession as 2 points. So I'm going to use some of that information, but I did want to preface that the reality is that what we're dealing with is very unprecedented. It's easy to think about this in terms of the Great Recession in 2008, and there are some similarities in terms of the stock market as well as income and so on. We'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing is that it's very easy to or natural to compare this with a natural disaster, right? And its concomitant giving. But the reality is this isn't like any of our normal disaster giving. A normal disaster has a pause period. It has a start, it has an end. And during that period of time, donors get to react. Right now, we're going through that process. There has been no period in which we see that. Although we are seeing an increase in giving in certain realms, anecdotally and only, and I'll talk about donor advised funds, in terms of people trying to find ways to help their community. And Fifth Third Bank, is leading that as we heard from Jadira, in terms of stepping in and trying to see how they can help, and many other corporations and donors and so on. Disaster giving, results in media and charities worrying about donor fatigue, right, and displacement of normal giving by disaster giving. But the coronavirus is different in that there is a pause, but there's no reason to think that there is going to be an acceleration phase of disaster giving for a couple of reasons. The development of tests and treatments, the vaccine, for example, are viewed as either public goods, hence the domain of government, or private goods. That means the domain of business or private sector. Nobody's likely to donate to either of these types of organizations, right? Ultimately, government is responsible for this, or business sectors were likely to recoup this through their profits. Third, typically the natural disaster does not cause a recession in itself, right? And 9/11 is the exception to that, as the attack on America also precipitated a relatively short and mild recession. Some of the same businesses, airlines, hotels were adversely affected then. The other aspect of this is that some of the giving that we're going to experience or have been experienced are not ways in which you can count, right? It's not ways in which we can measure. People are helping friends. People are helping relatives, neighbors with food, childcare, and informally rather than via institutions. People are setting up their own GoFundMe projects for their communities and friends around them to help out. People are helping informally through their schools and churches, right? And there's also an inequitable economic impact. Many, especially college educated, will be able to work remotely and remain employed and paid. Recessions inherently slow the economy, so those who earn their income from transaction may be harmed as well, right? Others will be unemployed and underutilized. And think about colleges, corporate offices, street vendors, parking lot attendants, wait staff. And some industries are going to be specifically damaged. Consider think about the airline industry, and just yesterday or the day before, Warren Buffett announced that he disinvested from the airline industry in terms of the entire in terms of their investments, as an example of what this looks like. So with that, I'm going to present the research that we have, and then try to use both my academic hat as my practitioner hat to make some suggestions. I'm also currently in the field with two surveys, one of individuals and the second of nonprofit organizations, arguably specifically Muslim nonprofit organizations. And while we don't have those findings to share yet, but some of those learnings I'll also incorporate into my conversation. So Carrie, if we could go to the third slide, which is the 2018 contributions. So in the 2018 contributions by Giving USA, you'll see that $427.71 billion were donated to philanthropy. And while this is a big sum, one should note that philanthropy only accounts for less than half of what the nonprofit sector receives. In fact, a larger portion of this comes from government grants and so on. But when we focus on philanthropy, what you'll notice is that 68% of giving in 2018 came from individuals. Foundations accounted for 18%. Bequests, or people passing away and leaving something behind, was 9%, and corporations represented 5%. Now, while I'm on this slide, I wanted to quickly just note, and as you probably already are noticing, one of the things I'm hearing both in my institutional survey is that those of you that receive foundation grants, when you're going back to your foundation supporters, they're very open to, many of them are open to the idea of changing what may be programmatic grants to operational grants. Now, that's not saying that that's the case all across. I have no research findings about the percentages, but that's what I'm hearing as I'm speaking to nonprofit leaders, is that foundations are committed to your success, committed to your survival. And within that, they're showing flexibility in that regard. And so for those of you that receive foundation grants and have had that chance, go and speak to your foundation program officers. Let them know how you're dealing with the crisis and what you're going through. And in some cases, nonprofit leaders are reporting that foundations are coming back and saying, how else can we find to support you? And I think for within that, this is an important conversation to have with your foundation officers. Carrie, if we can go to the next slide. So the next slide basically shows in 2018 how this money was divided up, right? The $427 billion. 29% was religion, and by far the largest, and that's been the case consistently for as long as we have been measuring this. 14% for education, 12% for human services, 12% to gifts to human grant making, health, and so on. The one point I'll make for religion is that while religion represents, in this case, when we talk about religion, we're specifically speaking about places of worship, Islamic centers, churches, synagogues, temples, right? There are other parts of our giving that are motivated from religion and religious giving. For example, you may give a donation to an Islamic school or a Catholic school. That would be captured under education. But giving to places of worship is the highest. And while it's consistently been the largest, we have also seen a consistent decline in that area. If we can go to the next slide, Carrie, which basically shows the total giving over time, and it starts from 1978 and all the way through 2018. What I'd note here is that you'll see that in times of where the global domestic product, when we haven't been in a recession, in general, we've seen an increase. There's only one exception to that, and that is if you look at the 2017-2018 number. 2018 was the first time we saw a decline in giving at a time when the stock market was up and GDP was up. There wasn't a recession. And it's too soon to tell what that may be, but it may be around, maybe associated with the Tax Reform Act, where the year before people to capture more tax credits may have given more. But again, we don't have that, but largely economists believe that it may have something to do with the Tax Reform Act and so on. And future research will help us share some of that and get some more information about that. So if we can go to the next slide. I also wanted to focus on, if you think about high net worth individuals, people that have over $1 million of assets, not including their home, and $200,000 in annual income. If you think about percentages of households, 54% of high net worth individuals gave to 54% of them gave to basic needs. Then religious care, health care, combined charities, youth and services, disaster relief was 25%. If you look on the right-hand side, it talks about the share of total giving. And religion, as you can see, accounted for 43% of giving by high net worth individuals, households. 19% was the next highest, and that was towards basic need, then healthcare, then education, and then youth. One quick thing before we move into predictors of charitable giving, and then we can go to the discussion for today, which is that when you think about high net worth individuals, far too often in some nonprofit leaders, they worry about whether their donor, if they start giving to another nonprofit, would impact them. The reality is high net worth individuals, just like their investments, they diversify their investments, they diversify their philanthropic investments. And the number of organizations that an average that a philanthropic donor, high net worth individual gives is around 7. So on average, they'll give to 7 organizations. So with that, just some basic things out of the way, I did want to focus on what are predictors of charitable giving. So as I mentioned earlier, when the stock market is up, giving goes up. When the stock market goes down, giving goes down, right? Second, as personal income goes up, individuals are more likely to give more. As personal individual income goes down, they're less likely to give. Some natural reasons. And then the final piece is that previous giving typically predicts future giving. So there are donors that have given to you in the past, and the fact that they've given to you in the past gives them a lot higher propensity to give to you again. So far too often, when we're thinking about fundraising, we're always thinking about getting new donors. But the reality is, research shows that one of the most important things that we can do is focus on our existing donors. We should always build a base, and I'll talk about that a little while, but we should really focus on stewardship of our existing donors. These are just some natural metrics, but in essence, what this shows is that the retention rate, so donors that gave last year and then gave again this year, nationally, this number has been consistent below 50%. And your focus, whether you're in a recession or you're dealing with the pandemic or any other circumstance, is to be above this number, and ideally have a very high retention rate, and that is exemplified by exemplified by donors giving to you again and again and again. So the higher your retention rates, the longer sustainability you have, the more sustainability you have within your fundraising, and the better the chances you have in terms of raising more money over time. So what are the challenges ahead, right? So I've talked a little bit about that. So the one thing is to look at the stock market. The second is the economic downturn, potentially. And then the third is disaster relief. And we've already talked about the disaster relief part, so I won't share that. The second part is about stock market. And a lot of worries is that if you go back, sorry, Carrie, if you go to the next slide, which says the challenges ahead, lessons from history. As I said in the predictors of charitable giving, the stock market indicates whether or not giving will go up or down or decline. So with the stock market decline initially because of the closing of businesses and the COVID pandemic, there was some real angst about that. And it's possible that the stock market may not rebound to its earlier levels, in which case asset bases will have declined, right? However, if things turn around and by the end of the year, the stock market increases, what you may see is by the end of the year, increase in giving to your organizations. And since many donors tend to give at the end of the year, the stock market can be sort of, while right now may be sort of volatile, hopefully by the end of the year, if we see increases, we'll also see end of year giving increases in this area. And again, these are all guesses, hopefully well-educated, wild guesses, but guesses, all the same. The next thing is, it's about the issue that we may face is an economic downturn. With already businesses have been seeing a decline. We've seen unemployment on the rise. Congress has stepped up and tried to sort of deal with this issue through a number of different economic stimulus so that they can sort of try to keep the economy running. But economic downturns will have an impact on giving. And to show you what kind of an impact, if you go to the next slide, total giving 1978 to 2018, and this is a slide that I showed you, but specifically the arrow shows that after the Great Recession, which is the most recent economic downturn, we saw a 15% decline in giving over 2 years. Now, nothing to say that this will be similar or more or worse or better, but this just gives us an indication of where we are over time. One of the things you'll also, that I don't show on this slide, is that we also see issues of nonprofit mortality. So many nonprofits merged during the last Great Recession because of the issues of giving. Some nonprofits shut down, but it didn't happen as drastically as people thought. And what's important is to continuously think of ways in which you can preserve cash flow, preserve your team, and preserve your organization so that you can respond to the challenges ahead. So with that, I just want to quickly go into some fundamentals of fundraising, because ultimately when you have challenges like this, the natural idea is to sort of try to find new innovations that take us away from some of the best practices. And ultimately, one of the things that I've argued, and this is what I have found through my time as a practitioner, is that while we should always be innovative, and we should be doing that regardless of whether there's a pandemic or not, we should always be thinking about doing ways in a more effective way that respond to the market as it is and to individuals. We really should make sure that we have our T's crossed and our I's dotted in terms of having the best practices. So if we go to the next slide, when we think about the fundraising cycle, and I'm not going to go into this because I know that you guys have more questions, and I want to make sure I respond to those questions at the end. But in essence, what I wanted to make the point is that fundraising is a cycle, right? And so for us, especially if many of the organizations that I deal with are Muslim nonprofits that are in the midst of Ramadan, and unlike most nonprofits, Muslim nonprofits rely 80 to 90% of their fundraising during this time. So the pandemic is hitting them right in the midst of Ramadan, which is probably the most important period of time for them in terms of giving. So for them, they were, if you think about this cycle, they were all the way at 11 o'clock where they were going to solicit the gift. And all this uncertainty has hit them then. But for most nonprofits in the United States, this cycle may be different, both in terms of your institutional calendar, but also in regards to your individual solicitation cycles for your donors. And so the key thing that I only raised this here is to remind us that while right now we may not be receiving funds, or we may, depending on the kinds of work we do and the cycles in which our donors are, there are plenty of things on this list that we can do right now to ensure that our fundraising cycle and our connection with our donors and our engagement with our donors continue, and so on. So while there is there is, and I won't, this is, I think there is sources of reasons to worry, we still have some important tasks ahead of us that can help mitigate that worry. Carrie, if we could go to the next slide. Because if you think about how the corona pandemic impacts us, right? For those of us that have fundraising events or galas and so on, it's that the pandemic makes that difficult. And one of the challenges that Muslim nonprofits deal with, which are nonprofit organizations that I do my research on, majority of their fundraising happens either through special events or it happens through congregational fundraising, both of which have been shut down. But the reality is that the most effective way of raising money is by connecting with people individually, right? It's taking a board member or the chair of the board or another donor and having them connect with them. The one challenge for that is that in this pandemic and times of social distancing, that those traditional measures of taking someone out to coffee and lunch may not be possible. But the reality is that many of your major donors understand those challenges, and provided they're doing okay and have the time, having a Zoom or GoToMeeting or having a face-to-face meeting using this digital technology, a lot more of your donors at your major gift level are getting used to that. You can still send personalized letters. You can still make phone calls, right? If we can go to the next slide, Carrie, we can still do phone-a-thons. If you think about the thing that we can't do, which is the fundraising benefit or special events, it's all the way third from the bottom. The only things worse than that are door-to-door or just a general marketing or media campaign. So the key thing is, while there is things to be worried about, there are, if you think about the most effective ways in which we fundraise, and you all know this really well through your practice, it is that one-on-one connection with your major gifts. If we can go to the next slide. And disregard the unique Muslim nonprofit dynamics. I didn't edit that out, sorry. But the challenges ahead, if you think about your donor pyramid, it generally has three parts. You have the base, which is 70% of your donors, which represent 10% of your giving. Then you have upgraded gifts. These are donors that gave you 20%. These are donors that give 20% of your giving. And generally, these are people. Upgraded gifts are people that gave money last year and this year gave more. And then finally, you have your top 10%, 10% of your donors that give 60% of your giving. If you think about the top, right now, you should have different strategies, just like you do in normal times, in dealing with these segments differently, right? So your social media and your internet and so on is informing all of them, but largely is targeting the base, right? Although major gift donors pay attention to what your social media, your website, and your marketing looks like. But at the top of your donors list, your stewardship techniques are really important. I'll talk a little bit about that. If we go to the next slide, Carrie, donor pyramid fundraising strategies. All this says, in essence, is that at the top of the donor pyramid, you should be focusing on one-on-one connections, phone calls, letters, and personalized contacts, right? Rather than generalized contacts. And these are things are made difficult because some of our donors at the top are stressed right now. But right now is a time for us to make sure that our donors are okay. It's our responsibility as major gift officers, as fundraisers, to reach out to our donors to make sure, one, that they are okay. Second, to let them know that we're still here. And third, to talk about what their worldview is like as a donor and what do they worry about. In many ways, in many cases, you'll find once they beyond the personal concern, they're also concerned about the mission that the challenges to the joint mission that you both have. So the stewardship is really important. If we can go to the next slide, Carrie, the stewardship slide. Stewardship is the job of supervising or taking care of something, such as an organization or property. But the reality is, when we apply stewardship to fundraising, our job is not to supervise or take care of our donor, right? They would have something to say about that. Our job is about supervising and taking care of our mission. Our job is supervising and taking care of the relationship, which is a joint responsibility between the two parties. So if we can go to the next slide. We're coming towards the end, and then I'll end with some strategies and then open it up to question and answers. So when we think about stewardship, many people think of stewardship as a thank you letter or a thank you call. But the reality is the stewardship is much broader. It's about using the gifts wisely. It's about using gifts for the intended purpose. It's managing the mission well. It's about having impact and communicating all of this to the donor, right? So stewardship is not just about the communication to the donor. It is making sure that we have the four things done, and then we're communicating all of those things to donors in very specific ways, which are very strategic to that donor level and very specific to that donor. If we can go to the next slide. Again, many of you already know this. Stewardship is not thank you. It simply begins with gratitude. So I want to go to the next slide, which is just some research based on my colleague, Dr. Lori Parlberg, who's the Charles Stewart Mott Chair on Community Foundations and a professor of philanthropic studies, and really focus on donor advised funds. Because I think at this time of uncertainty, one of the things that I think there's a window of opportunity is related to donor advised funds. And just to sort of talk a little bit about that, if we can go to the next slide. This slide talks about what a donor advised fund is. For those of you that are familiar, I apologize, just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. A donor advised fund is when a donor gives a donation to a fund, and the fund is held by a sponsor organization. So here in Indiana, Central Indiana, the Central Indiana Community Foundation has donor advised funds. Commercially, Fidelity, Schwab, many businesses own donor advised funds, right? And so donor gives the sponsoring organization and gives money to a specific fund called a donor advised fund. And right away, the donor gets an income tax deduction. Now that money sits there until the donor advises the sponsoring organization to give money to a charitable nonprofit. So let me just sort of couch this in, let's say donor X, Joe, gives $10,000 to a donor advised fund, the Joe Donor Advised Fund, which happens to be at the Central Indiana Community Foundation right now. Immediately, Joe receives a tax deduction, but there is no obligation for that money to be given out right away. And so that money sits there. It could sit there for a day, or it could sit there for years before that money is given out. And what we know is that over time, donor advised funds have become one of the fastest growing vehicles of philanthropic giving. In fact, Fidelity is now considered to be one of the world's largest foundations, largely because of its donor-advised funds portfolio. And so right now, there is money sitting in donor-advised funds that can be has only one purpose. They can be given out to a charitable nonprofit organization. So if I have a donor-advised fund that I advise and I've given money to, and I'm having challenges with my mortgage, it can't pay for my mortgage. If I've lost my job and I have to pay bills, it can't pay my bills. If I have to give money to a friend or someone, I can't do that. The only thing that money can be used for is for charitable nonprofit organizations. And this is a time where if you have donors that have donor-advised funds, you can make the case that this is a time of need where donor-advised funds can sort of really help mitigate some of the broader challenges we're facing in philanthropy and fundraising. And what we do know, based on just the Chronicle of Philanthropy and recent reports, is that donor-advised funds are showing an increased give out during this last couple of weeks, during which after the pandemic was announced. So donor-advised funds are money that donors have placed for philanthropic purposes for when the time is suited. And this is a great time for us to make the case that this is a suitable time for them to give out. So the question is, how do we know? If we can go to the next slide, Carrie, and then go to the next slide again. How do we know who has a donor-advised fund and who doesn't? So the first thing is work through the mediated relationships. There are donor-advised funds, the Central Indiana Community Foundation, Fidelity, and all of those organizations that have given money to you in the past have charitable advisors. Make sure you're reaching out to them. Make sure you're stewarding them. Make sure you're having conversation. Make sure you're trying to establish relationships. Beyond that, go through your database and look at whether you received money through a donor-advised fund. And if you did, if it doesn't tell you who that donation came from, you can reach out to the sponsoring organization and try to see if you can establish a relationship with the donor through them. And once you make a list of all those donors that have given money to you in the past through donor-advised funds, this is a time to see if you can steward them for potential support. The next thing is, if you go to the next slide, Carrie, make it easy for donors, right? So if you look at DAF Direct, you can put this widget on your website. So if a donor comes to your website and sees this widget, then you can, it'll trigger to the donor, hey, wait a second, I was going to give them money through a credit card, but I do have this donor-advised fund. And this makes it easier for them to give from their donor-advised fund. The next thing I don't have a slide on, but what I would recommend, and I've suggested to nonprofits that advise, is in your materials, put somewhere proudly receive funds from donor-advised funds. Now, of course, everybody receives it, but the point is that you're triggering this information. You're letting your donors know that you're here and you're available to receive money through diverse ways. And donor-advised funds, I believe when we do research next year, the year after, we will see that donor-advised funds really played an important role, I hope, fingers crossed, while educating guests, in helping us mitigate, making things better. And things would have been much worse had it not been for donor-advised fund money sitting in donor-advised funds right now. I'm not endorsing donor-advised funds. I just want to make that point I'm making is it's there, the money is there, and it's potentially money that can help make this time of crisis less worse, as it were. Bad English, but I apologize for that. But anyway, next, let's go to the next slide. Just quickly go to strategy, and then I wanted to quickly open it up to Q&A. The key thing is don't get distracted. Your mission is still relevant, right? Focus on your mission. Understand how COVID-19 is impacting your mission. make sure you're helping your donors understand that's the case. COVID-19 did not resolve the problems that existed that resulted in the reason for your organization to come about. Your organization came about because there was a problem in the world that needed to be solved, and your organization solves that problem. That problem exists now. It is impacted by COVID-19. Make sure that you make the case of how it's impacted. If you don't have a written fundraising plan, make sure to have one. If you don't know how to do that, take one of our courses at the fundraising school. Make sure you have a gift range chart. Look at that gift range chart. Examine how it could be impacted again. Look at your donor data. Think about who are some of the donors and how they're impacted. In the Muslim nonprofit community, many of their donors are doctors or physicians, and many physicians are in private practice. And they are impacted because right now people aren't coming to the hospitals, people aren't coming to practices. Their practices, so in essence, they're like entrepreneurs whose businesses have been shuttered. Examine that, have an idea of what your donors are going through so you can respond to them. Reach out to your donors and make sure they are okay. I always think about donors are friends, and then what would we do with our friends? We would reach out to them and make sure they're okay. Do the same thing. Look at who could be your champions and who can help you reach out to donors so that they can sort of be out there. Your board members, your development committee really plays an important place here. Remind your stakeholders why they started giving to you in the first place. Ultimately, donors give to you not because you need the money. Donors give to you because they have a vision of the world. They have a dream, and you make that dream possible. You are a dream maker, and it's important that during these times of nightmares, we remind them of those beautiful dreams that got them into this journey with you in the first place. Have a strategy for each part of your donor pyramid, even at this period of time, whether it's Zoom calls and GoTo meetings, whether it's social media, etc. Proactively think of ways in which you can do what you are doing with less, and most importantly, survive. Cash flow reserves are really important. Think of ways in which you can reach to your donors and try to make sure that your organization survives. And then finally, innovate. I won't go into it since I know you guys have already talked about the stimulus and the government and emergency funds. With that, if we can go to the next slide, Carrie, my email address is here, and I know we have around a few minutes left, so I'd love to open it up for questions if there are any, and you can always reach out to me through here. You'll also find me on the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy website contact list. And so with that, I'll stop and hand it back to Carrie.
Thank you, Sharik. Does anyone have any questions? If so, we will open your audio so that you can ask your question, and you can do that by raising your hand on the site. See if there are any questions here. Okay, I don't see any questions, Sharik, at this point. I do, yes, there is one here from Christina McDougall. Christina, I think you're self-muted. Christina? Hello, Christina? Sharik, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Carrie, can you hear me?
Hello?
Hey, Carrie, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yep.
My phone dropped off, so I do apologize about that. We do have a question from Christina McDougall. So, Christina, you can ask your question. Christina may have dropped off as well. So it looks like folks are saying that the audio is not working.
Oh.
So I think that's all the question. We have one question from Cheryl Reed here, Sharik. Cheryl?
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Cheryl? Let's try Laura Grove. Laura?
Yes, I wanted to know if you had a program. We had never solicited funds before, but this year we had to start, and we were doing okay in January, and then of course COVID hit. So what advice could you give to someone who doesn't have current donors in how to approach the donors out there?
Sure. So I think in many ways, it's certainly a challenging prospect because donors may have focused on different things, specifically with relationships that they already have. But what I would do is I would create a constituency map. I would think about who are people that are likely to give towards that. So if your organization has a current group of donors that you feel some of them may be willing to sort of upgrade or give more and focus towards this cause, that's one aspect of it. The second part of it is to really try to find institutional or corporate donors that may be willing, that have supported you in the past and may be willing to sort of help mitigate some of the programming costs for this year. But ultimately, the work that you would do in terms of finding new donors for this program is challenged by this time because of COVID-19, because donors may be worried about their personal income, or they may be worried about their existing philanthropic investments. But at the same time, the process would be the same in terms of who are normal donors that would be giving you money for this program in normal circumstances, and trying to make those connections. If there's any way in which you can find current institutional partners that may help you mitigate this, because that task may be more difficult unless your program or project is very directly COVID-19 focused. That's the other way to think about it. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Carrie, any other questions or?
Yes, one question that came through, Sharik, is when do you think giving will be back to normal?
I wish I knew. First of all, a lot of it depends on the factors that I mentioned, right? One is, how does the stock market do with the current challenge? So if stock market rebounds, let's say, market indicators are good as states are starting to reopen, the economy gets better. Let's say we can rebound faster, then So I think a lot of these external factors will decide, and none of us, quite frankly, know that, because fundraising is directly connected with all of these factors, right? The stock market, personal income, the GDP. And as we determined those things, with the Great Recession, it was a 15% decline over 2 years, but then we quickly made that back up. But honestly, I wish I knew, because I think I think this is one of those Nobel Prize winning kind of questions.
One other question is, what are practical things we should do differently in times such as these?
So I think in many cases, there are the one thing that we should do right now, which is make sure that we are right now focused on our donors. In the past, we've been really focused on our donors in terms of how they are partnering with us in our mission. But this is a time where our donors are stressed, right? And so when we needed our donors, when we wanted to partner and stand hand in hand with them, the focus was all about the mission, right? At this time, I think it's important that we make sure that our donors are okay, because they're going through the same stresses at home, and so on. So I think make sure we emphasize that, because regardless of whether they can give to you now or not, what we want them to remember is two things. One, when there was a crisis, this group of people, this organization was concerned about my welfare and not just about my money. And second, that when there was a crisis, this organization continued to show me ways in which that mission could survive. And those are two things that may not result in money today, but may result in significant relationship building over time.
One of the same line of questioning from the same individual. Any news on existing federal grants and their flexibility, or additional advice on how to seek reallocation of funds from federal grants?
I think the key part of that is to reach out to the program officers, just like your foundation grants. Now there are stronger strings attached to government grants because they are subject to statute and administrative protocols, right? But if there is any flexibility, the officers there, the program officers, are more likely to sort of help you understand what those are and how to apply for those measures. Ultimately, regardless of whether it's a foundation or it's government or corporation, it's individuals that inform and make decisions right on that, and make sure that you know who are the right individuals for those grants so that you're having those conversations with them.
All right, Sharik, that looks like, let's see, we might have one more question. Nope, that's all of the questions.
Thank you so much for having me. And if anybody has any questions that come up later on, they can email me and contact me through my profile on the Lilly School of Philanthropy website.
Well, thank you, Sharik, and we really appreciate your presentation today. Join us next Monday as we explore the topic of leadership in times of stress with a focus on team leadership. That webinar will start at 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, we thank all of you for participating on today's webinar and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.